Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking LSU with Matt Moscona. You can join him on ESPN Radio, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans. His show after further review Monday through Friday, 3 to 6 Central Time. Matt, how you doing?
Mark, I'm great, man. Thanks for having me as always.
Probably the College World Series loss right now is our gain. Oregon State ended things for the Bayou Bengals there.
Yeah, man. It's Baton Rouge is kind of an amazing market, and it is truly unique. And I use that in a literal sense, like only one, where college baseball, in particular LSU baseball, can carry ratings. So when LSU baseball makes a run like they did a year ago into June, deep June, that's a fantastic thing for a Baton Rouge radio guy. When they get bounced in the regional round on the road, that's not so much fun.
You know, Matt, we both have our recruiting people we go to, and they're sniffing out 2021 prospects that are 3 stars, those guys. But then when people are hitting me up about a commit, and they're not real recruiting people, they're like you and I that love college football, are deep into it, but just want to know when a guy signs and when he commits, first and foremost, are talking to me about this Derek Stingley Jr., then it must be a big commit.
Yeah, so it's big for a lot of reasons, Mark. And I think you see a lot of times in college football, you got guys that are highly sought after, highly coveted, that maybe aren't even if they're great players, they're not transcendent to where might, even if they're great, it might not lead to great team success. I think generally that's reserved for quarterbacks. I mean, you can think of a guy like Jadeveon Clowney, who was awesome at South Carolina, obviously, but South Carolina had a good run there, but it wasn't one of those transcendent type deals where they're all of a sudden going to be competing for a national championship, like if you were able to get a number 1 player in the country in basketball. The thing with Stingley, though, it was so critical for LSU to get him for 3 reasons. Number 1, it's just need. LSU did not sign a cornerback in last year's class. They're going to lose Greedy Williams likely early to the draft. There's still uncertainty with this weird case with Christian Fulton, who's a former 5-star. And then Terrence Alexander is a grad transfer that they signed, who he'll obviously graduate and be gone. So they're going to be razor thin at corner next year. So they need this to be a big cornerback class. So when you get the best corner in the country, it's a great need, and you're filling it with the best guy available. I'd say number 2, it's the fence around the state. People in Louisiana talk about that since the Nick Saban days, keeping the best prospects home. In years past, guys like Ed Reed and Reggie Wayne would go to Miami, and Warwick Dunn and Travis Minor went to Florida State, and Major Rapp White going to Texas. And you had great talent from the city and from the state leaving the state. And LSU's championship teams in the 2000s were built around Louisiana guys like Michael Clayton and Marcus Spears, and you can look guys like Odell Beckham or Tyrann Mathieu, Jacob Hester. You need to keep the best players home, and that's another thing they're doing with Stingley. And I'd say third, man, is perception, because realistically, Mark, after the way last season ended for Ed Orgeron and LSU, there's a lot of people that see the arrow pointing down in Baton Rouge, and not only the way the season ended, the ugly bowl loss to Notre Dame, ugly losses last year to Troy and Mississippi State, the Matt Canada fiasco, hiring from within with Steve Ensminger, almost losing Dave Aranda, but having to pay him $2.5 million to keep him around. It was sort of like one negative block after another. And in this recruiting cycle, you're seeing that Orgeron start to get some momentum. So the perception around the program is starting to change as well. So I know it's a lot to put on one kid. It's a long answer, but it explains in part why you're getting the type of response you are to the Stingley commitment.
Hey, Matt, the long answers are fine if they're good answers.
Yeah.
So definitely some good stuff there in putting this into context, not just as a signing of a superior talent, but of the guy that could mark better things, because certainly the better players in the nation tend to bring others with them. And when we look at what LSU has achieved just since about April 1st, it's not certainly, aside from Stingley, been on that level, but it's been encouraging. As you mentioned, a lot of guys that you would expect LSU to be in the fight for, and they've brought those kind of guys in.
Yeah, I mean, you could talk about Joe Burrow as well, who I know we'll talk about, but that's another big chip for Ed Orgeron. He didn't sign a quarterback in last year's class, and they came through spring and weren't super confident with any of the 3 guys they had. And the best guy available in the country was Burrow, the Ohio State quarterback who lost the starting job to Dwayne Haskins, was a grad transfer with 2 years of eligibility remaining, and Ed was able to go and woo him and steer him away from a school like Cincinnati that was thought to be a prohibitive favorite. They're in Ohio. Luke Fickell's the coach who had him at Ohio State. Burrow's dad is an assistant coach at Ohio U, so they got deep ties there. It's big, and if you're just talking about specifically, we can talk more about Burrow if you want, but if you're talking specifically about 2019, there's Stingley, there's Maurice Hampton out of Memphis. They also got Speedy Banks out of the Houston area. When you're talking about corners, LSU needing a big cornerback class, and they're putting one together. Cardell Thomas is one of the top, if not the top, offensive guard in the country. He's from Baton Rouge at Southern Lab, and he's been committed and kind of been. You mentioned like other guys follow. He's kind of been the Pied Piper. He's been one of the best recruiters in this class for LSU. So I know it feels a lot, Mark, when you talk about LSU like you're talking about the 2019 class and moving toward 2019 and the future's bright. That doesn't do a lot to alleviate the pressure on Ed Ogeron and this coming season, which could be bumpy. But if nothing else, you can see like, okay, well, there's reason to believe that it can and will steadily improve.
So just here in the last 6 weeks, as Matt outlines, Marcus Banks, Speedy Banks, I'll lock that one away. Top 40 corner from Houston, Marcel Brooks, outside linebacker, number 6 in the country from Texas as well. Anthony Bradford going all the way up to Michigan to bring in a big guy on the offensive tackle side, top 20 to 25 prospect at his position about a month ago. But let's get back to the quarterback. So I'm thinking that the groundswell down there in the Bayou is that here's our savior, Joe Burrow, and he's automatically got the job when it was Miles Brennan's to lose, it appeared before that. Whereas obviously I get more of a national feedback from the people that watch me, and it's either Burrow's awesome, and of course, if he was going to possibly win the job at Ohio State, obviously he's got to be a huge upgrade for us, or the guy's never thrown a meaningful pass. LSU is going to be a disaster this year and win 5 or 6 games. There's little in the middle. That's
kind of it where everybody is right now, Mark. I mean, you pretty succinctly explained it. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Urban Meyer has a reputation as a quarterback guru, and if he recruited this guy, that he's got to have some chops. I think you look at Burrow, and physically, I think he's what they hope Miles Brennan becomes. 6'3", 6'4", 215, big arm, 21 years old, just more physically developed and probably a little more polished, where Brennan's trying actively to put on weight and get above 200 pounds. He's probably in the 195 range right now. So, I think what they did in adding Burrow is adding a guy who, while he doesn't, he's got the same experience as all the other guys on campus right now, which is basically none of great significance. What they did was add a guy who, as a prospect on paper, when you're looking at measurables, looks more ready than the other guys do currently. So as far as if he's the guy, he's just got to be. You don't go and sign Joe Burrow without the intent of him being the guy. Now, maybe it's one of those things where you add him into the quarterback room and you let them all go compete. And if Miles Brennan uses this summer and really emerges, or if Justin McMillan continues to develop and improve upon the spring he had, that maybe one of them win the job. And it's essentially one of those situations where whoever wins the job falters, then they give Burrow his chance. But, man, Mark, it's so hard for me to see that, man. It's hard for me to imagine them signing Burrow and not starting him. So if I had to bet today, man, who's the guy week 1 against Miami? If I had to bet, like if you were making me go to a ticket window in Vegas, all right, who is taking the first snap? I'd have to think that's Burrow.
Yeah, I've got to think that as well. I would think he would need to falter in August camp for that to be otherwise. My thoughts on the whole, is he going to be a boom or a bust, is that, okay, you've got this week 1 matchup with Miami that, especially on my channel, people love Miami, and they jump on here. And then I've built up maybe a little bit of an LSU following because of that, because they've jumped on in defense of LSU in this week 1 matchup. And Malik Rozier comes off a 26 touchdown, 3,000-yard season. But if you watched the games, he really wasn't that good. Sure, he has talent around him, and to win the Miami job, you have to be decent. But he missed a ton of throws and really faltered down the stretch. So I know Malik Rozier's about, a 5 or 6 on a scale of 1 to 10 of FBS quarterbacks. Joe Burrow, we don't know because he hasn't thrown the meaningful passes. So he's going up against a known factor at that position. But if I had a gun to my head, I would guess that Burrow's going to be better than Rozier. Is he going to be better in week 1? Maybe, maybe not. But I would guess through a half season that Burrow is going to be better than Malik Rozier. Maybe not significantly, but I think he's going to be decent.
The thing about Rozier, though, is he really had a boom or bust quality last year. I mean, there were times where Rozier looked fantastic. I saw an interview this offseason with Mark Richt where he talked about them just wanting more consistency from Rozier. And if they get that, then Miami could absolutely be a contender. I mean, I know they lost a ton on defense, but I mean, Mark, there's a reason they're a preseason top 10 team. And he's a big part of it. Having stability at quarterback matters, and LSU doesn't have that. But like you said, with Burrow, it's all just a guessing game. Like anybody that tries to speak with any absolutes or any definitiveness when it comes to Joe Burrow, they're lying. I mean, because nobody knows. The guy just hasn't done it. And I would feel so much better about this LSU team if they opened up at home with a layup against a group of 5 team, or one of their non-conference cupcakes, whatever. And then maybe had a winnable SEC game in week 2, then another, non-conference game, sort of a 3-week tune-up before maybe you saw an Auburn or someone like that on the schedule. What's unforgiving about LSU, and certainly for Burrow as well, is you open with that game at a neutral site against Miami. Week 2, you got Southeastern Louisiana. Week 3, you're at Auburn. I mean, it's just an unforgiving start to the schedule. You got another non-conference, and then once you get into October, I mean, I don't think Ole Miss is going to be very good, and you get that game at home, but you have this stretch where you're at Florida, who I think is going to be much improved and is one of the most veteran teams in the country this year. You're going to have to play Georgia at home. Mississippi State, who has everybody back and whipped you last year by 30, is on the schedule. Then you have your bye, then you got Alabama, and then you're at Arkansas. It's just like you can see how if you start to slip, like if you hit that mud patch and you start to slip, how it could spiral on you. And I think this LSU team is really, really talented. I don't think there's any question that Les Miles, and by extension Ed Ogeron, since he's taken over, they got a whole bunch of guys on this roster, but they don't have our experienced guys. And inexperience against this kind of schedule typically doesn't breed great results. That's why you're seeing a lot of the projections for LSU where they are this year.
And the week 1's unforgiving for Coach O because it's a top 10 quality team, but it's especially unforgiving for Burrow because if they were playing Oklahoma, sure, the overall team's in the same range, but the defense is marginal. Maybe he has some breathing room, but this defense is like top 5-ish type caliber coming back, and it's really good. So that's going to be difficult for them to make some hay in the passing game, but we shall see. So you're leading us down the path of schedule, which is brutal. Over under at 7.5. Man, those numbers haven't been that low in all sorts of years.
I'm trying to think the last time it was. Probably Nick Saban's first year, I would think. Probably that 2000 season was the last time. LSU was coming off a 3-win season under Jerry DiNardo when he got fired, and Nick was hired in 2000. It was probably the last time the projected win total was this low. And it's a weird feeling in Baton Rouge, Mark, because you have the pockets of fans that are super optimistic, that are used to LSU, beating teams like Mississippi State, and that sort of being understood. But when you're realistically looking at the two teams and you take the names off the jerseys, like you recognize that State beat you by 30 last year. They got everybody back. Oddly enough, with guys like Jeffrey Simmons, they may have one of the best defensive lines in the country this year, not just the SEC, in the country. Arkansas has that's an interesting spot because new coach, not a ton of talent there. I think they struggle in year 1 under Chad Morris. You get Jimbo Fisher, who's got a lot of experience back on his team at Texas A&M, and you get them in the last playing day of the regular season, and you're on the road in College Station. Like that's one of those teams that's probably much better in week 12 than they are in week 1. There's just so many pitfalls, whereas like LSU has not lost to A&M since A&M's been in the SEC. And that's one of those games where you look at it and you go, you know what, they're probably a road dog there, in the last game of the regular season. And that's a series LSU's dominated, but could go the other way this year. It's just one of those, like, I don't think, except for Bama and maybe the road game against Auburn, I don't think you're going to see LSU as like a massive underdog to anybody. But I think you're going to see a lot of 3-point spreads and less, pick 'em games. And it's just a question of, can LSU's inexperience find ways to win games in the fourth quarter? Like, I think they're going to play a ton of close games. It's just the success or failure of the season is going to be, can they finish those games? But like everyone in Vegas that's picking LSU at 7-5, like, I get it. LSU's going to be an underdog to Miami. They're going to be an underdog at Alabama. They're going to be or at Auburn. They're going to be an underdog to Alabama, to Georgia. They're probably a home dog to Mississippi State, as odd as that sounds. So, like, I mean, if you're just placing wagers and you're putting odds on things, like, I get it. I get where the Vegas prognosticators are coming looking at this season.
Yeah, it's almost like a perfect storm. We hit a numbers cruncher on last night, Matt, Jake Wimberly, and we basically looked at it, and I kind of made a spectrum comparison between Iowa and LSU because everything schedule-wise is in Iowa's favor. They play cupcakes in the non-conference. They play in the weaker of the two divisions in the Big Ten. They don't get the toughies in the other division, so they miss Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, and he has a projection at 11-1 on Iowa. I think that's a bit extreme, but then we look at LSU at the same time, and I said, if you put these two teams on the same field, this game's a toss-up. If not, LSU's a more talented team, therefore the favorite. But man, because of the schedule being brutal, and it's not like the SEC's up here and the Big Ten's down here, it's just the perfect storm of a schedule in which LSU has to face, even though Florida was down last year, most likely the two most talented rosters in the other division. And it just comes together with this Miami game as well as being just a rough go.
Schedule matters, and not only who you play, but when you play them. Like, for example, look at the Texas. We talked about Texas A&M. If LSU played Texas A&M in week 2, that's probably a very different game than in week 12, because I think A&M, as Jimbo gets to know his personnel, and they become more comfortable within his system, I think A&M's a much better team at the end of the season than they are in the beginning. Likewise, I'd say some may say the same for LSU. That very well could happen. But if you played this Miami team 2 years ago, this looks like a layup for LSU. If the rotating cross divisional this year wasn't Georgia, if it was Kentucky, and you got Kentucky coming to Baton Rouge instead of Georgia, well, it's 2 games right there that you could flip, and 7 all of a sudden looks like 9. And if you get some breaks in a big-time game, maybe you get to 10. So who you play, when you play them, it absolutely matters. To ignore that or to diminish that, I think, is foolish. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those years that feels kind of like the perfect storm for LSU. Now, does that mean that LSU fans are going to be cool if LSU goes 7-5 this year? No. I mean, you haven't had one of those in these parts in a long time, man. Not since that 08 season with Les. And when they lost 5 games in 08, they were 1 year removed from a national championship. And they dismissed Ryan Perrilloux before the season. And I think everybody sort of recognized going in, okay, that's unacceptable, but there were some extenuating circumstances. And Les brought in John Chavis as a defensive coordinator. They got stability at quarterback, and they kept recruiting, and then they just built it back up to a championship level again. But I don't know that Ed is going to have the same rope as Les did. Les had earned himself an awful lot of credit because of, obviously, the championship and the way that he had started in those first 3 years in Baton Rouge. Ed still has to prove a lot of doubters wrong. And so I'll be very interested if things do go that way this season, what the reaction is. Certainly, I know it'll be externally, but I'm curious what it'll be internally.
So Matt, for me, and what I would think to be reasonable fans, if LSU goes 7-5, but they look the part. Like they're top 25 good, but they don't have the ranking next to their name because they're 5-4, then they're 6-4, but they're playing those teams that you're mentioning within a touchdown. And then they get the 6-week gap. They go play a bowl game against a like seeded team in another conference. And wow, they just beat Iowa by 2 touchdowns, or they beat a Pac-12 team that's on their level, like a Utah or somebody like that, like a Stanford, and they beat them by a touchdown, and they pull off a performance that concludes that season. A reasonable person can say that schedule was brutal. They hung with everybody, and even if there's one blowout against an Alabama in there, and then they beat a like-seeded team in another conference, we're moving in the right direction. Now, if that turns into a Butch Jones where we keep losing close games, and now it's been 3 years, and this is just going to keep happening over and over, that's another deal.
If you wanted a comparison from a year ago, I'd give you Texas with Tom Herman. They went 6-6, but they lost an overtime game at USC, who at the time was a top 5 team. They led Oklahoma late and wound up losing in the last minute of that game. They were on the road at Iowa State, who at the time, I think Iowa State was ranked in the top 10 when they played them on the road. Texas played one of those brutal schedules where they lost 4 games against top 10 teams. Oklahoma State.
Overtime.
Yeah, overtime. They lost 4 games against top 10 teams, either in overtime or in the last minute when they led within 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. And you can look at that and go, okay, man, like 6-6 is ugly. And then they, of course, won their bowl game in a rout. You go 6-6 is ugly, or 7-6. It's not the expectation. But, man, this team was right there with a freshman quarterback hanging with top 10 teams through 3+ quarters. And they might have something cooking there in Austin. Like I agree with you how it looks, Mark. Like if LSU, loses on a field goal at the gun against Miami and goes on the road against Auburn and manages to play them within a score, and they beat Mississippi State and they beat Texas A&M, they lose tough ones to Georgia and Bama at home. You could be looking at an 8-4, 7-5 season, but you could say, man, they're right there in all those games. And there's reason. I agree with you how it looks. Now, the flip side of that, Mark, is you look at LSU a year ago, where they finished the regular season 9-3, but look at the 3 losses. They lost by 30 to Mississippi State, which was the worst loss in the history of that series. They lost at home to Troy, and they got blown out by Alabama. So none of those were good losses. And if you look at the wins, LSU a year ago had 2 wins, 2, against teams that finished with a winning record. Auburn and Texas A&M. And A&M fired its coach. And they needed a flat miracle to come back to beat Auburn. So you can tell, well, they were 9 wins last year and they were a breath away from winning the Notre Dame game and getting to 10. But if you're realistically looking at how that 9-4 looked, it wasn't a good look last year. It wasn't a fun or particularly inspiring season last year.
All right, folks, I'm not ignoring the live chat, just not a lot to play off of, except for this, I don't know if this is worth the time, McMillan and Narcissi, do they have any shot in this quarterback race? People are asking.
So Justin McMillan, for those that don't know, he's a rising redshirt junior, so he's entering his 4th year in Baton Rouge. He kind of came out of spring feeling like the leader, but when they signed Joe Burrow, Mark, I think the consensus on McMillan is that he's going to transfer. He'll graduate in July, and he'll be eligible to go wherever he wants with 2 years of eligibility remaining. And I think that's the general consensus in these parts. Like I would be personally, and I'm not breaking news, man. Like I don't know definitively what McMillan's planning to do, but after they added Burrow, man, I would be stunned if both of those guys, both Burrow and McMillan, were on the roster together this year. I think McMillan is a guy who graduates in July and probably looks for an opportunity as a grad transfer to go elsewhere. Lowell Narcisse is an interesting one because he's the sort of change of pace guy. Burrow and Brennan and McMillan, they're more of your prototypical like pro style type guys, whereas Narcisse is an athlete. Like he's built like an NFL running back and he's playing quarterback. He's got a huge arm. He's a lefty. He's just kind of needed to harness that skill. And he also was coming off 2 torn ACLs in high school. So he kind of needed that year last year as a red shirt to kind of get healthy and get acclimated to the college game. The question is, with Steve Ensminger as offensive coordinator, are they running an offense that suits Lowell Narcisse? And does he stick around? And I don't know. I mean, it's plausible that both Lowell Narcisse and Justin McMillan transfer, this offseason. I don't know definitively, but it's just, look at college football. Look at the nature of college football. Quarterbacks don't stick around. And if you're Narcisse and you've already burned a redshirt year, are you going to wait around in Baton Rouge not playing, or do you go JUCO to be able to play somewhere in 19 where you can be a starter? We saw Lindsey Scott do that a year ago. Lindsey Scott redshirted his freshman year in Baton Rouge. At some point in fall camp, he realized he wasn't going to get a crack. He went to Mississippi Gulf Coast Junior College. They won a JUCO national championship. He commits to Missouri. So, I could see that for Lowell. Neither guy has spoken on it. Neither guy said anything. But, just the way the quarterback position works today in college football, it's plausible that can happen, yeah.
And Matt, basically, based on what I've seen in the spring game and based on what I've heard, Joe Burrow, yeah, he's going to drop back. He's going to make his reads, and he wants to be that kind of quarterback. But if he needs to take off, he actually can threaten a defense. He can run. He's not Drew Bledsoe limping to the sideline, just trying to make the first down marker. He can actually threaten a defense with speed.
We'll see. I haven't seen it. Nobody has, but we'll see if he can. But what I do know is that Ed Orgeron was part of Pete Carroll's staff at USC in the early 2000s. And when he talks about offense, that's what he wants. He wants the Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush, Lendale White type offense. Two imposing backs with different skill sets and a quarterback that can direct the offense and wing it around. And that's the type of offense I believe Steve Ensminger is going to call, and that's the type of offense that Ed Orgeron wants his quarterbacks to run. I don't think you see LSU ever get to a point where they're running under Ed Orgeron, where they're running what Gus Malzahn runs at Auburn. I think Ed wants to build USC of the early 2000s, and I think Burrow is probably the guy that gives them the best chance to do that.
Okay, Matt, one last thing. Looking at the quarterback situation, looking at the over-under, looking at the schedule, in a sense, taking that aside and just looking at personnel, the word talent has come out of your mouth a couple times in reference to the roster. But since you've been covering the team and for as much as you know beforehand, before that, does this team have more unknowns and more wild cards and X factors and questions than you can remember?
Wow, probably, yeah. I mean, just without giving it a ton of forethought, and the last time that LSU had this many questions, Mark, I mean, you got to understand the reason I'm stumped. It's like LSU's gone through this almost 20-year period where, whether it's realistic or not, they're expected to contend every year, for at least for the West, if not a national championship. So, I mean, yeah, probably. And aside from maybe Les's first year where you knew they had a bunch of talent, but you just didn't know what the new coach was going to bring. Maybe 2009 coming off that rough 08, but they got dudes. They got 4- and 5-star guys that they've signed. They just don't have a ton of experience. And the things where LSU has been great, running back, defensive back, that's where they're thin this year. So it's even more odd because the things that have been the pillars for LSU, right? DBU and then Fournette and Darius Geis and Jeremy Hill and Stephen Ridley and Michael Ford. I mean, just Charles Scott, Keelan Williams, Jacob Hester. I mean, go through the list, where LSU's always been great. That's where they had their biggest question marks this year. So it's just a very odd year in Baton Rouge. And I think you'll get that tone from almost anybody you talk to about LSU this year.
Love the LSU football talk with Matt Mosconi. You can join him at ESPN Radio, Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel where I have these kind of discussions across the map with the very best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the industry. Matt, the show's exceptional. For those that can't get it the traditional way, where can they find it digitally, podcast, anything in that form?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, 1045ESPN.com. You can stream us or download our app. Just go search ESPN Baton Rouge in your app store. Download the app. You can listen to the shows live. You can podcast them. We also have a live video stream of all of our local shows. You can click the watch live button on our app as well. So appreciate that.
Matt, the facial hair looking good.
It's a new thing, man. The only person that doesn't like it is my wife, so it's probably not going to last.
Oh, well, that's the one. It could be 1 versus 1,000 and she wins. So that's what happens there.
Card.
Thanks so much, Matt.
You got it.